That was me, last month, sipping lukewarm coffee on my porch as the wind rattled the dry leaves against my boots. There was a silence in the air. Not peaceful. The kind that comes before a storm. Except, instead of thunderclouds, it came wearing sunglasses, a pink visor, and a clipboard, the most feared species in my neighborhood, a homeowners association Karen. Now let me back up and explain before you think I'm just ranting that I live in what used to be a peaceful semi-rural community, tucked just outside city limits. About 30 homes, scattered acres apart, each one with its own slice of land. I've got 5 acres, a barn, and the pride of my property, 6 Highland cows. You know, the big fluffy ones with the horns that look like they belong on a medieval tapestry. They're not just pets. They're part of my family. And more importantly, they're trained, yes, trained. Not like circus trained, but let's just say, if something disturbs their routine, they respond. A few light commands, and they'll come when called, avoid strangers, even patrol the perimeter. Why? Well, after an old coyote problem, I decided to reinforce their instincts. Turns out, Highland cows are a lot smarter than people give them credit for. Anyway, back to Karen. She had moved in 2 months ago, right at the edge of the subdivision, bought a home with an acre next to mine. She wasn't a rancher. She wasn't even a dog person. She was the clipboard and rulebook type who had clearly mistaken our neighborhood for a suburban cul-de-sac. And from the minute she arrived, she started pushing for the HOA to clean up the area, which, translated, meant make everything look like her Pinterest board. She hated the barn. Called it an eyesore. She hated my cows. Said they were aggressive looking. And most of all, she hated the fence. A simple wire and wood boundary that had stood undisturbed for 15 years, until she showed up. The warning sign started subtly. A snide remark here. A passive-aggressive letter in my mailbox about livestock infringing on community beauty standards. Then came the HOA meeting, where she proposed we reevaluate fencing regulations. I didn't think much of it. We weren't part of a city HOA, ours was more neighborly than legal. But Karen? She came with ambition, and then, one Thursday morning, I woke up to the sound of wires snapping. At first, I thought it was an animal. But when I stepped outside, there she was, halfway through my fence line, bolt cutters in hand, and a smug little smile on her face like she had just rearranged her living room. I froze. You're trespassing, I said, jaw clenched. She looked up like I was the crazy one. This fence is violating code. I sent you 2 warnings. The HOA gave me full authority. I wanted to yell. I wanted to rage. But instead, I just looked behind her, at the pasture, because what she didn't realize, what she couldn't have known, was that cutting that fence didn't just make a hole in my property line. It opened a door, and my cows, they remembered the last time someone crossed it. What she'd unleashed wasn't just livestock. She'd invited a reckoning. The wind shifted as if nature itself held its breath. Karen, standing there with her bolt cutters like some kind of suburban warlord, didn't notice the shift. But I did. I've lived on this land long enough to feel it when something's not right, when something's about to happen. The fence now had a jagged, gaping hole roughly 5 feet wide, the wire curled at her feet like dead snakes. Beyond it, in the early morning fog, 6 massive shapes began to stir. Now, let me be clear. These aren't ordinary cows. Highland cattle are already formidable on their own, broad-shouldered, long-horned, shaggy like they came straight out of a Viking saga. But my herd? They had names, they had routines, and they had a memory. Cows are smarter than most folks think, especially when they're treated with respect, and trained. I raised them from calves. Conditioned them to associate certain sounds and signals with commands. When the coyotes came a few years back and nearly took my favorite heifer, I started working with a behavioral vet, someone who trained service dogs and military K9s. We figured out ways to reinforce natural herd protection instincts. Fast forward to now, if anything crosses the fence line without me present, they treat it as a threat. Not like bulls would, charging blindly, but something almost tactical. So when the fence dropped, it wasn't chaos. It was calculation. They saw her, all 6 of them, Dusty, Belle, Rumble, Tinker, June, and my bull, Thorne, lifted their massive heads. Not a stampede. Not yet. But a slow, coordinated walk toward the gap. Their hooves thudded on the earth, deliberate, heavy. Thorne came first, nearly 2,000 pounds of horned muscle with eyes the color of river mud and just as deep. Karen finally noticed, I said. She repeated, as if her voice still held any authority, "This fence is a violation of community." But she didn't finish. Thorne stepped through the opening like a guardian of some ancient gate. He didn't run. He didn't lower his head. He simply looked at her. A long, slow stare that froze her in place. Cows don't have sharp teeth or claws, but when one that size looks at you like you don't belong, you feel it in your bones. Karen took a step back. Then another. "They're loose," she whispered, her voice catching. "They're not supposed to. They were supposed to be behind the fence," I said, not moving. "Which you just cut." Rumble and Belle joined Thorne, flanking him. The 3 of them blocked the hole now, standing shoulder to shoulder like sentries. Karen was outside the fence, but the herd didn't care. That fence was their line, and she had crossed it. Then it happened. Thorne took a single, thudding step forward. Karen flinched and dropped her bolt cutters. She tried to retreat, but Dusty had looped around the side, cutting her off. Not close enough to touch, just close enough to control her movements. Herd instincts. Predator response. She wasn't dealing with cows anymore. She was dealing with a unit. Karen screamed that it wasn't a loud scream. It was the kind of scream someone lets out when their brain is still trying to decide between fight or flight, but neither seems to be working. She turned and bolted toward her side of the property, stumbling over her ridiculous wedge sandals as she tried to run. Tinker, the smallest of the herd, but also the fastest, followed at a casual trot, staying just close enough to keep her moving, but never so close she could call it aggression. Just assertiveness that I let them herd her all the way back to her neatly manicured lawn. And the second she crossed it, Thorne let out a low, deep bellow. A warning, "Stay out." Karen collapsed on her front porch, red-faced and panting. I stayed behind, calling the cows back with a low whistle. They stopped in unison, turning with a discipline that would make any drill sergeant proud, and began filing back through the broken fence as if nothing had happened. Peaceful. Composed. Vengeful in the most organized way possible. Karen didn't say a word, but I saw her hand shaking as she reached for her phone. She wasn't calling the HOA, she was calling animal control, and that's when I realized, this wasn't over, this was war. By the time animal control rolled up the next morning, I'd already patched the fence, not perfectly, mind you, just enough to close the gap. Enough to make a statement, "I'm reasonable. I fix what's broken." But I'd also left behind the very obvious cut wires and Karen's bolt cutters still lying on the grass, untouched. Evidence. Because I knew this was coming. Karen wasn't the type to let something go, even after being gently escorted off the property by a herd of hairy justice. I was sipping my coffee on the porch again when the white county truck bounced down the dirt road, tires spitting dust like a nervous dog shaking off rain. 2 officers stepped out. One was tall, clean-shaven, stiff posture, the kind of guy who probably alphabetized his sock drawer. The other was older, heavier, with a clipboard and a thermos he clearly valued more than the badge pinned to his shirt. "Mr. Weller," the tall one called out. "That's me," I said, standing up. I kept my tone calm, but my heart was hammering. Not because I was worried, my cows hadn't done anything wrong, but because I knew how stories change when a Karen is involved. "We received a report that your livestock escaped and acted aggressively toward a neighbor," he continued. "Possible property damage. Potential endangerment." "Ah," I nodded, motioning for them to follow. "You'll want to see this." I led them along the fence line. As we walked, the cows watched us from the pasture, lined up along the far ridge like a woolly jury. Calm, chewing cud, eyes patient. The tall officer glanced at them nervously. "You said they were aggressive?" he asked. "Not in the slightest," I said. "But let's take a look here." I stopped at the breach point. Still visible, despite the quick repair. The wire had been cut clean. Not torn. Not chewed. But sliced through with sharp force. The bolt cutters lay right beside it, untouched since yesterday morning. That I didn't say anything. Just let the scene speak for itself. The older officer bent down and whistled. "Well, that ain't the work of a cow," he muttered. "Looks like someone went all Edward Scissorhands on this line." The younger one frowned. "And you said a neighbor?" "Yep. Name's Karen Myers. Lives in that blue-gray colonial right on the edge there. She's been trying to push the HOA into banning livestock altogether. Said my barn is an eyesore, and my animals are intimidating." I handed him a copy of the last passive-aggressive letter she'd dropped in my mailbox, laminated and all. He read it. Slowly. Then raised an eyebrow. "And the cows?" "They walked out when the fence was opened. Saw her in the yard. Didn't touch her. Didn't trample her. Didn't even nudge her. They just stared. Followed. Maybe boxed her in a little." I paused, then added, "They're trained to respond to intrusions. Not attack. Respond." The older officer looked up from his clipboard, squinting toward the cows. "Trained cows," he repeated, blinking like that was a sentence he'd never expected to hear. I gave a half-smile. "Worked with a behavioral vet. Reinforced patterns, perimeter awareness. They can distinguish between friend, stranger, and predator." The younger one muttered something under his breath, but the older one chuckled. "I've heard of dogs doing that," he said. "Never cows." We spent the next 30 minutes walking the property, verifying that the cows were healthy, that the fence had been tampered with, and that no one, not one, had so much as a scratch on them. They even observed the cows up close. Thorne sniffed one of them and snorted gently. The officer practically jumped out of his boots. I just patted Thorne's flank and said, "Easy, big guy. These ones are friends." Before they left, the older officer leaned in and said, "Off the record? I don't think you've got anything to worry about. We'll file a report, but this looks more like a neighbor dispute than an animal issue." The younger officer added, "Still, you might want to keep the herd back from the property line for a bit. Just until things settle." I nodded. Understood. They left shortly after. Karen was watching from her porch the whole time, arms crossed, lips pinched. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. But her eyes were drilling holes through me like she was already planning her next move, and I could feel it too. This wasn't over. Karen had taken a swing and missed. Now she was wounded, embarrassed, and angry. I knew that look. She'd lost round one. But people like her don't just give up. No, Karen was the type to escalate, and as I turned back to look at Thorne standing sentinel by the barn, I said out loud, mostly to myself, but also maybe to the land. Get ready, boys. She's coming back. By Thursday evening, the flyers were everywhere, stapled to mailboxes, taped to the HOA community board, slid under doors like a paper plague, each one stamped with big, bold lettering: special HOA meeting, emergency session on unsafe LVSTOCK, and beneath that, my name. In all caps. Like I was a criminal or some local cryptid people whispered about at potlucks. That I wasn't surprised. After the animal control visit didn't go her way, Karen did what Karens do: she weaponized bureaucracy. And in a homeowners association like ours, that's the equivalent of launching a nuke. The meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m. sharp at the community clubhouse. It was one of those faux rustic buildings built to look like a lodge, complete with fake beams and artificial stone, but nothing could hide the coldness of that place. HOA meetings there always smelled like printer toner and stale coffee, and tonight, it reeked of ambush. That I arrived early, wearing my cleanest flannel and mud-free boots. I brought a copy of the state livestock code, my training documentation, and even a letter from the behavioral vet, just in case. I knew the rules better than they did, but that wouldn't stop Karen from trying to rewrite them. The room was already filling up. Retired couples. Parents with kids. A few dog walkers I barely knew. And in the center, flanked by two equally bitter committee members, was Karen, hair pulled tight, blouse pressed like she'd steamrolled it with rage. Her smile when she saw me? Thin. Predatory. She banged her gavel, yes, she had a gavel, and called the meeting to order. We are here, she began, to address a serious safety concern that has come to light. One that affects our community's well-being, property values, and the safety of our children. Karen always knew how to twist the knife, invoke the kids, scare the neighbors, and pretend it's all in their best interest. I was personally threatened by an aggressive herd of cattle, she continued, placing a dramatic hand to her chest like she was recounting a bear attack. These animals crossed a broken fence and pursued me onto my property. I almost spoke then, but held back. Let her spin her web. She passed around blurry photos of the cows near her lawn, images that conveniently cropped out the bolt cutters. She even held up her sandal, the strap torn, likely from her own fall, and claimed it was proof of the stampede. There were gasps. Murmurs. One of the board members, a guy named Glenn who once fined me for having dandelions, leaned forward and said, "This sounds like a liability. What if they had gotten loose during school hours?" My turn. That I stood slowly and walked to the front, laying down the laminated printouts on the table with a quiet authority that hushed the room. Here's the county livestock zoning permit, which this neighborhood falls under, I said. Here's the fence maintenance log. Here's a statement from animal control clearing my animals of any aggression. And here, I held up the final sheet, is the HOA's own bylaw document. Nowhere in it does it ban livestock. Nowhere. Karen started to protest, but I raised my voice just slightly, calm but firm. And the cut in the fence? You did that. I've got footage. Trail cam caught it all. You can spin this however you want, Karen, but you crossed my property line. My animals responded like they're trained to. No one was hurt. You trespassed and got spooked. A few of the gasps shifted. Now they weren't so sure who the villain was. Someone in the back muttered, "Wait, she cut the fence." Karen's face twitched. That polished confidence cracked ever so slightly. Regardless, she snapped, we still need to vote on whether livestock like these are appropriate for a shared community. She was trying to change the rules on the spot. Bypass reason. Rewrite the HOA playbook just to win. And then the surprise came. Old Mrs. Lansing, widow, 82, been living here since before Karen knew what an HOA was, stood up in the back row. Her voice was like dry gravel, but it carried weight. My granddaddy raised cattle. Those are good animals. And that bull? He saved my dog from coyotes last winter. I saw it happen. Let the man be. He's doing it right. Silence. Then, from across the room, another hand rose. Thorne chased off that bobcat last month. My kid plays by that pasture. I feel safer knowing he's there. Karen's face hardened as she realized the room was slipping away. Her vote would still go through. The board might still try to change things, but she hadn't expected pushback. Not support for me. The meeting adjourned with no resolution, just a promise to review the bylaws at a later date. But I knew what had happened. Karen had tried to rally a mob. Instead, she lit a fire under a community that actually respected a well-run homestead, but this wasn't her last move. No, Karen never quit after just one defeat. Not when her pride was bruised. And 2 days later, I saw the trucks. 3 of them, black SUVs, marked insurance claim adjusters, third-party property liability investigation. And I knew, Karen had just gone nuclear. By Saturday morning, the rumble of diesel engines echoed down the gravel drive like an omen. 3 matte black SUVs rolled up the slope, each emblazoned with some high-and-mighty insurance company logo and the kind of fine print that practically oozed legalese. Out stepped a small army, clipboards, sunglasses, stiff suits, and the same expression on each of their faces. They'd rather be anywhere else than dealing with cows. I stood by the gate, arms crossed, waiting. Thorne and the others grazed in the upper pasture, unbothered, as if they knew the show was about to begin. The lead investigator approached me first. A man with sharp features and a voice as smooth as a voicemail threat. "Mr. Halvorsen," he said, "we're here to assess the damages and determine liability for an incident involving your livestock and a community member. A Mrs. Karen Bellwood." There it was. The nuclear option. Karen had filed an insurance claim. She was alleging property damage, emotional distress, and, according to one document, sustained trauma due to the presence of unrestrained, predatory bovines. I didn't laugh. Barely. Instead, I handed over a USB stick with the trail cam footage. "You'll want to see this before you write anything down." He took it, reluctantly, and handed it off to a junior associate who plugged it into a laptop on the hood of their SUV. I stood silently as the footage rolled, Karen slipping through my fence with bolt cutters, the wires snapping like twigs, her smug grin fading the moment Thorne came trotting over with curious eyes and that unnerving stillness. Her shriek as she flailed backward into her hydrangeas played loud and clear. Her sandal flying into the air, well, that was just a bonus. The investigator said nothing. He just rubbed his jaw, then scribbled something on his clipboard. "We'll be noting this," he muttered, but Karen wasn't done yet. She emerged from her porch like a queen descending from her tower, hair perfectly curled, face full of innocent outrage. She marched up to the gate, eyes darting between the agents and me, clearly hoping to swing their judgment with her usual weaponized charm. "That's the dangerous one," she shouted, pointing at Thorne, who, on cue, looked up, chewed thoughtfully, and released a long, groaning moo that sounded like a funeral dirge. Karen flinched. "I was attacked on my own property," she snapped. "You were recorded cutting through livestock fencing," I replied calmly. "Trespassing, destruction of private property, and instigating a stampede, if that's what you want to call a few cows walking in your direction." One of the younger agents stifled a laugh. Karen noticed. Her nostrils flared like she was trying to compete with the cattle. But what happened next sealed everything. As the investigators walked the fence line to assess the alleged failure of containment, Thorne decided he wanted to help. He followed them. Just calmly paced a few feet behind, sniffing their coats and nudging the occasional clipboard with his damp nose. Then, one of the investigators dropped a pen. Thorne picked it up. Gently. With his lips. And offered it back like a polite waiter. The man froze, then smiled. He's trained? Military-style cues. Voice and whistle. He passed canine-level discipline tests last fall. Another agent jotted that down and said, "Impressive animal." Karen's eyes went wild. "He's a monster. He chased me. He responded to a trespasser," I said. "As trained." At that point, it was over. The agents wrapped up quickly, thanked me for the documentation, and left with the kind of professional distance that screams, "We're not wasting any more time on this nonsense." Karen stormed back to her house in silence, slamming the door so hard a garden gnome toppled. Later that week, I got a letter. The insurance company found no liability on my part. In fact, the footage and documentation would be used in a potential countersuit against Karen for destruction of property and filing a fraudulent claim. The HOA? Quiet. No new meetings. No more flyers. Apparently, some board members had seen the footage too, and suddenly no one wanted to be caught siding with her. Her influence collapsed like a wet cardboard box. And Thorne? That night, he wandered up to my porch, stood by the door, and let out a low, satisfied grunt, like a soldier reporting that the battlefield was secured. I reached out, scratched behind his ear, and muttered, "Good boy." Because when Karen cut my fence, she didn't know my cows were trained for revenge, but she damn well knows now at the end.